The background to this gospel is that people were always watching Jesus. The religious people were watching to see when he did something that went against the law. And we can assume that there were some representing the Roman authorities were watching to see if he did something for which he could legitimately be arrested. So, in that situation, one Sabbath, when Jesus went to share a meal in the house of one of the leaders of the Pharisees, they were watching him closely. When Jesus noticed how the guests sought out the best seats at the table, he told them a parable. When someone invites you to a wedding celebration, don't take your seat in the place of honor. Someone more highly regarded than you could have been invited by your host. The host who invited both of you will come and say to you, "Give your seat to this other person." Embarrassed, you will take your seat in the least important place. Instead, when you receive an invitation, go and sit in the least important place. When your host approaches you, he will say, "Friend, move up there to a better seat." Then you will be honored in the presence of all your fellow guests. All who lift themselves up will be brought low, and those who make themselves low will be lifted up. Then Jesus said to the person who had invited him, "When you host a lunch or dinner, don't invite your friends, your brothers and sisters, your relatives, or rich neighbors. If you do, they will invite you in return, and that will be your reward. Instead, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, crippled, lame, and blind, and you will be blessed because they can't repay you. Instead, you will be repaid when the just are resurrected." This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
You may be seated. Please pray with me. Gracious God, help us to not only hear but listen to your word. That the Spirit who is with us might nudge us to be the persons you want us to be. Amen. Your pastor is a lectionary preacher, which means he preaches each Sunday from a passage in the lectionary. It becomes my task today to use the lectionary passages. They're not necessarily passages I would have chosen, because the guest preacher doesn't want to deal with what's in these two passages. Every one of us uniquely looks at the world in a different way, a different perspective. Sometimes that perspective is inconsequential. Some of you like dogs, some of you like cats, you know. At other times, your worldview gets shaken. Some of you probably have been responsible for a wedding reception and the seating chart. There's always one member of the family, usually Aunt Maxine, who for days afterwards will tell you how unhappy she was she didn't get sitting at the right table. We all have those kind of people in our family. So worldview or perspective is uniquely different. But what I want to speak about a little bit today is, how did you get the worldview that you have relative to how you are a follower of Jesus Christ? Because the worldview that you have dictates how you think, how you speak, and how you act. And oftentimes, we don't really look at the worldview that we currently have. Sometimes that worldview is dated back when we heard Bible stories in Sunday school as children, and maybe what we went through at confirmation. But have we really looked at how those are part of our worldview now when we look at the world in which we live, or how it affects the faith that we have? Our worldview has been affected by sermons you heard, different churches where you were, books that you've read, religious television if you watch it. And so what these two passages in today's lessons ask us to do is to look at whatever worldview it is that currently dominates how we think, speak, and act. I found this exercise of these passages to be good, because I found myself, as I looked at my own worldview, saying, you know, I'm glad I'm not the person I once was. I'm glad I no longer hold some viewpoints that I once held. But I also know that I'm not the person I want to be. So it's good to look at why we believe what we believe. Now, in the first lesson that was read to you from the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah is taking to task those who have settled in the land that we now call the Holy Land. In other words, it's been hundreds of years and generations since their ancestors were led out of Egypt, were sustained in the wilderness, the desert, came into the lands where they are, and now that they're there and they're settled, they have begun to take on some of the characteristics of the cultures in which they now live, a culture in which there were many gods being worshipped. And so Jeremiah says to these folks, have you forgotten? Have you forgotten who led you through the wilderness, the deserts and ravines, the darkness, the land of no return? I brought you into a land of plenty to enjoy the gifts and goodness, but you ruined my land, you disgraced my heritage. You went after some other gods. He said, you have turned away from the living water, that is, turned away from that flowing out of God that continues to see you through difficult times. And he says, instead, you have dug cisterns, broken cisterns that can't hold water. Now, what was Jeremiah saying to these folks? In that land where they were living, there was little rainfall. And so in the soft limestone, they would dig deep cisterns, and then they would, because the limestone was soft and the water in the cistern would seep away, they would plaster the cistern, but at times the plaster would crack and the water would disappear. And he says that the worldview that you're holding now, the worldview that you're holding that has incorporated some of the characteristics of the lands in which you live, where you have forgotten a God who has never forsaken you, is like people who put water in a cistern and see it seep away, because the faith that you had, the faith of our ancestors, is seeping away. It's no longer sustaining you. It's no longer going to help you build the community that God expects you to communicate. So we ask ourselves, what's that mean to us? It means that when we look at our worldviews, are we also buying in to some of the aspects of the culture in which we live. It's a very easy thing to do. Maybe some of you have heard me mention this before, but are you familiar with the metaphor of the camel's nose? In the land where the Bedouins lived, in tents, this person would say, remember, don't let the camel get his nose in the tent, because if you do, very soon, you're going to be sleeping with the camel. And this is what we're saying about adopting the worldview of the cultures in which we live. When we allow those to begin to invade our life, pretty soon it's the culture around us that determines how we think, act, and speak. So think of the culture in which we live, where there seems to be an increase in rudeness, a lack of civility, a divisiveness that's trying to divide us based on the color of skin, the language we speak, the land we came from, our ethnic heritage, our gender designation. And when we allow some of those things to creep into our worldview, we begin to see other people with that kind of view. And so this is what Jeremiah is cautioning us about. Because though there are no other gods in our culture where we build shrines or set up worship services particularly, but we can begin to make some other things so important in our lives that we lose sight of what's really important. I don't, at this point, want to step on too many toes, but I probably will a few. I find when I read obituaries that when the most important thing that's in an obituary is that the person loved the Cavaliers, the Browns, or the Indians, I'm wondering what is really most important in their lives. That this is the most important thing to put in the obituary. So you have to ask yourself from your worldview, what are the most important things in your lives? What is it that's sustaining your faith? What is it that's keeping that which you had to seep away a little bit in the culture in which you live? Well, then we come to this gospel lesson. And it seems when you first read it, very simple lesson. Jesus is saying, apply this to your lives. Don't push so that you get first in line at the potluck. That's not what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is saying to us, this is kind of a metaphor about how God works. This is about a metaphor about how God works in the world. And Jesus is saying, don't look just at this story about who gets first in line at a dinner or something, but look at what you have seen in me. Remember, you have seen me talk to women. You have seen me eat with sinners. You have seen me reach out and touch people that were unclean. You have heard me talk about inclusiveness. You have never seen anything in me that was characteristic of exclusiveness. So, when we look at our worldview, we have to ask ourselves, is there any part of what we believe that is causing us to be exclusive? Are we looking at people who are not in the same economic place that we are? Are we looking at people whose education is not like ours? Are we looking at people whose sexual identity is not what the world says it should be? Are we looking at people whose skin is colored differently, whose language is different, whose origin is different? Jesus is saying you'd never, ever find those things in my worldview. So this is why I've said before, these lessons have caused me to look at my worldview and say, thank God I'm not holding some viewpoints that I once held, but also I need to remember that I'm not the person that I need to be. Now, the same thing can happen not only to individuals, but it can also be present as a church. Because, in a sense, the church develops a kind of worldview. And they begin to look at the world around them. And I've heard churches that, well, we want more people, but we want more people just like us. We want more kids, but we don't want those kind of kids. Or we are to be in the community for the community. We are to be looking inclusively at where God has placed us to serve. This is the season of Pentecost. And one of the things that we believe is that when Jesus was about to leave us, he said, when I go, I will send another to be with you, sometimes as a counselor, sometimes as a comforter. But John Wesley, with his doctrine of prevenient grace, says, usually it's the Holy Spirit nudging you to be a better person, to be a better church than you really are. And when we begin to do that, when we begin to see the world inclusively, all people, we no longer will look at somebody else sitting with us and say, well, I remember when that person said something that offended me or did something that... We no longer look at people that way. We look to see Jesus Christ in everybody. Everybody here, everybody at the checkout at Walmart, everybody that is in the gas station, everybody where we go. We begin to look for Christ in all people. And we begin to find ways as a church to begin including all people. This is why Jeremiah said, be careful that you don't dig a cistern where the water seeps away with a worldview that's going to constantly be seeping you from those things which have always been a priority in your life to buy into the culture in which you live. My friends, we all know how somehow our lives have been transformed in Jesus Christ. And we are to be Christ in the world, that others who do not know will discover the transforming power of Jesus Christ that changed us. Amen.